Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, we're so glad to have you. I am Will Wright, your political host. I'm joined by my faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Good, thanks, Will.
And joining us today, we have Jennifer Smith Richards. She is an investigative reporter with ProPublica whose work exposes abuses by powerful government institutions. Her current reporting examines how the Trump administration is reshaping the federal government's role in education and what that means for students' civil rights in schools. And today, she is here to talk with us about all the things in Oklahoma. So welcome to the show, Jennifer.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to start off first by asking a little bit about your career. So looking it up, seems like you've been in this education space for a very long time. and whenever people have a specialty, whether that's, education, religious nationalism, or whatever topic that they are studying, I'm always curious, what was it that got you interested to, start looking at how we teach people in this country?
I probably fell into schools reporting by accident, but once I was there, I think I realized just how truly universal and consequential, particularly public schools are in this country. And I don't know, it's it's such an interesting beat because you get a little bit of everything. You get government, you get politics, you get crime sometimes. You get business, right? So you get to cover all of these different sort of topics that intersect and are so important to people's lives and their communities. So it's just, it's just a great beat to write about the world and write about, the American experience. So
yeah, that's really cool. I mean, when you think about it, education really is the beginning part of just about every American's life where they start learning about America. And, depending if you've ever read Jason Stanley's books on education and fascism, he really goes into detail about why education is so important in America and why it generally is the first place that people with authoritarian tendencies tend to focus on. So I'm curious with that context in mind, I'm curious why Oklahoma is the sort of focus of your writing. I mean, I don't know how many school districts there are or whatnot in the country, but it seems like the school districts within Oklahoma have had an especially hard time in the past several years. So give us kind of the broad overview, what's so special about Oklahoma and their education system?
Yeah, great question. So, Oklahoma is obviously a pretty conservative state, and yes, there are other conservative states in the country that have sort of tested out some ideas that are more conservative leaning in the education space. But Oklahoma was particularly primed because it had this political landscape that featured a supermajority, Republican supermajority in the state legislature, featured a conservative Republican governor, a conservative Republican attorney general, and then the introduction of Ryan Walters as superintendent, who was elected, who was, by most definitions, very aligned with Christian nationalist ideals. So over a number of years, Oklahoma really was positioned politically to accept sort of this testing of more, farther right education ideas.
Yeah, that is so interesting to me, looking at this and seeing, basically, if we want to look, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the basic argument in your article is that if we want to see what an American first, patriotic, kind of Bible forward, anti-woke agenda for school is, kind of almost like the poster child, we should look at Oklahoma for what's happening there, how it's being pushed forward. Do I get that basically right?
That's it. I mean, people may be familiar with, for example, Louisiana enacting the Ten Commandments bill. So
right.
You've seen bits and pieces of this elsewhere
Texas.
in the country.
Right. So what's the difference? Go ahead.
I was just going to say in Oklahoma, what you've seen is sort of all of the things. So it's the Ten Commandment
Gotcha.
and the Bibles and the social studies standards being rewritten in a pro-America, sort of American exceptionalist idea. You've seen a little bit of everything, the anti-DEI bills, anti-trans bathroom bills in schools. So a little piece of things that we've seen, again, sprinkled throughout the country and other red states, really were concentrated in a few years in Oklahoma.
So it's like they were having, excuse my kind of, maybe it's not a crude analogy, but I don't know if it's a good one. But so they're having like a side, like they're getting some a la carte things on the side, and Oklahoma is ordering the full menu, catering, that kind of thing. Like they're all in on this whole thing. Is that a decent analogy for that, of what's happening?
It is. It is. And it's like, a very long dinner, right? Like it's like over a period.
They're gonna get real stuffed.
Yeah, it's over a period of years. And it's with, the governor and the legislature and the state superintendent and the attorney general on board.
So you got power united. So what I'm trying to do is paint the picture for people so they understand what's really being like said in this, and why it might be an issue or not an issue to them. And so just this is my last, and I'll jump over to Will. So you talk about the new social studies standards. Outline that for us. What was it? What is it now? And why is it problematic?
So the social studies standards before, and again, for listeners who may not know what standards are basically a state's map of what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. And in Oklahoma, the standards before were pretty standard. There was like one mention, there was like one mention of the Bible maybe, but that was it. They pretty much were aligned with the social studies standards for most states. Ryan Walters entered the picture and decided to rewrite the standards in a way that really aligned with his beliefs. So Oklahoma has a review process like most states every few years. I think it's every 6 years. They look at the standards and say, do these still make sense? Are they representing everything we want kids to know about U.S. history and about civics? Ryan Walters looked at these standards and said, no, what we need is more information about the Bible and the Bible's role. He believes in the founding of America. He and a group of other people came up with the idea, like, we really need to represent the disagreements about the validity of the 2020 presidential election. And we need to, include some discussion about the origins of COVID-19. So by the time they were done, there were at least 40 references to Christianity, to Jesus, to the Bible, that got specific enough that, you're teaching particular, parables and, very, very specific biblical teachings that were included in statewide social studies standards, which, just to be clear, is really unusual.
In a red state like Oklahoma, you would think that type of change would be widely accepted. I know it wasn't, and it's not, but help me work through why, Ryan Walters coming in the door, making all these changes really seemed to kind of upset a lot of people. And is the change and, kind of the change in the superintendent as well, because he's no longer there, was all of that just a product of the loudest voices, or was there actually a groundswell of people that are I don't like what's happening in my state?
I think it's fair to say that Ryan Walters was pretty widely disliked by educators, including, conservative Christian educators, who really objected not to biblical teachings and not to Christianity, but objected to a public school being the vehicle for delivering biblical doctrine. And I think it struck so many people who had been educators for a long time as such a departure from the norm, where there was a pretty defined separation between church and state. Teaching about the Bible was left to churches and to people's local, choices of church. And it was not something that, for example, your US history teacher was going to be delivering. And what I found in reporting, and surprising or not, even in this very conservative state, conservative Christians were really uncomfortable with the idea of their child's teacher delivering their version of Christianity or biblical teachings.
So your article says that this is ground zero essentially for the conservatives' quest for more patriotic and Christian public schools. Back in 2014, there was this project called Project Blitz, which was this project by a bunch of conservative right-wing folks that wanted to use like states essentially as little testing laboratories. If you're familiar with Project Blitz, like would Oklahoma kind of fit nicely into sort of like that definition of it being a bit of a petri dish?
I suspect so. I mean, if you've read Project 2025 and all of the kind of goals and the roadmap it sets out for education, there's pretty close alignment with what we're seeing in Oklahoma. So a lot of the things that are wish list items in Project 2025 appeared in Oklahoma. And I want to say, like, particularly were sort of turbocharged under Ryan Walters, who really was working his way down that list. So the answer is yes. Like, do we know the intent of the state's leaders, that they intended to purposely make Oklahoma a lab or a petri dish? We don't know their intent, but we can see through the policy that they've worked down that they very much are checking off the big items of Project 2025.
So it's kind of like something we all do. We make an inference based on looking at these several things that are happening, right? So they're not going to say, hey, we're basing our education system off Project 2025. They're not going to make that statement. But you can look and you can compare, hey, like Project 2025 education priorities, Oklahoma American First education priorities, and they map on pretty consistently. Is that what you're saying?
And not just in that idea of like America First and American exceptionalism. I mean, if you think back to the St. Isidore case, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that would have been the first religious charter school in the country. Well, that was tested in Oklahoma, right? And that's something that Oklahoma's leaders were very much, in favor of, and we've seen that tested there. The other thing that we've seen out of Oklahoma that we've not seen elsewhere is Ryan Walters coming out earlier this school year and saying, standardized testing, it's done. We're not doing standardized testing anymore. That is something that is a little bit of that's a conservative ideal, that you shouldn't have this sort of like government watch over, this government accountability.
Right.
So you've seen some of those things that map, that go beyond the kind of patriotism and Christianity space into the more, kind of like wonky, how do we run schools space that really, again, like align with the ideals in Project 2025.
Yeah, I totally, that makes sense. So is the narrative, and maybe again, correct this wherever I'm getting it wrong, is the narrative or the story, is it like, hey, you got these bunch of guys that are colluding in conspiracy style, or is it more, this is a wave of ideology and thinking that's now taking place? Like, I guess, like, would we have documentation if they're meeting together? I mean, I guess you can keep that stuff secret, but it doesn't seem like you can keep it secret for that long, right? I mean, that's the whole thing about conspiracies, the cabal that's taking over the whole world and nobody, but there's no evidence. Well, of course, there's no evidence. They wouldn't allow any evidence for it. So that kind of thinking, and I kind of want to avoid that thinking, but I do want to know, like I hear these connections, and I just know there are people that I know that aren't going to have a problem with Jesus being mentioned 40 times. They'll be like, hey, look, this is our history. This is part of the cultural, soil that America was grown in. Why wouldn't we honor that history? Whatever. And they would see, hey, this just seems like there's no conspiracy here. This is just good education. What's the kind of argument that you have on that one? I do want to press on that because I think that there are people that listen, and of course we all have our own views. It's totally cool to have that, and you've substantiated yours in this article, and I appreciate that. And I just want people to hear your thinking and not just write you off because you're a liberal or you're woke or you're whatever, right? I don't want people to do that. You might not care, but I don't want people to do that when they listen. And so what would your kind of response to that? Again, this is history, culture, and is this a conspiracy, or is it more a movement, a wave?
Yeah. So let's talk about the arguments against this first, and then let's address conspiracy. So I think that what I heard from a lot of conservative Christians in Oklahoma about like why they would have discomfort with teaching, that Christ is king, for example, and that the country was founded on biblical principles is pretty simple. Is all Christianity the same? Is every denomination the same? Does everybody believe the exact same things and place the same importance on some principles versus others? And so they would raise the question, and speaking to them, well, whose version of Christianity will be taught? Will it be
That's
the one
a great
that
question.
right? Will it be the one that my family aligns with? And will it be what my local pastor teaches? And the answer is kind of no, right? It may not, there's no guarantee that what is being taught, from the Bible even, is going to align with your understanding and your beliefs. So I think that was the single biggest thing that people told me was causing discomfort about the idea. It wasn't just the idea that the Bible is an important historical document and the Bible, lays out important, character foundations.
Right.
It was like, what Christianity are we teaching here? Like what version? As for the conspiracy, I'm not going to say the word conspiracy, but what we know, like
that's good.
What
that's
we
wise.
know, what we know is about influence, and for some of these, significant policy shifts, there have been the same people in the room helping make decisions. And so let's talk about influence. So Ryan Walters, in rewriting these standards, brings together a group of people to act as advisors. And they're names that we know. They are Dennis Prager, right? The founder of PragerU. They are David Barton, the founder of Wall Builders. It is, Dr. Kevin Roberts from the Heritage Foundation. So these are familiar names that then come together to help influence what Oklahoma's social studies standards are going to become. So those voices that we know, that are familiar, that are driving education policy elsewhere, are in the room here in Oklahoma.
Yeah, David Barton is a name that comes up quite a bit in our conversations when we talk about Christian nationalism.
Not too many historians I've met are big fans of David Barton.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
and on his website, he actually argues that the three branches of government are modeled after the Holy Trinity, and yeah, so hearing his name kind of in the mix of curriculum building does make me a little bit nervous, even though I think he's now helping with Texas or something like that. But I am curious, like, so you mentioned those names. They're all kind of in the room with Ryan Walters. They've got, I'm assuming, probably ready out the box curriculum. Like, talk to us a little bit about the curriculum. Say, for instance, like PragerU provides to Oklahoma, or did provide.
Yeah. So the standards, again, are a little bit divorced from the curriculum, right? You lay out what you want kids to know and be able to do, and then a state selects, options. Typically, and in Oklahoma, this is true. It's true in Texas. Options that school districts can choose, that they say this is good curriculum to follow. What Oklahoma did after these standards were there, was they pointed to PragerU kids and said, hey, if you want really solid history and civics lessons, here you go. This is ready to go. And they actually posted it just on their social studies website, on the Oklahoma State Department of Education's website. So you go there and it's like big PragerU kids presence. And PragerU kids, I'm sure your listeners know, is like, it's an off the shelf, like digestible, short cartoon video style delivery of a very particular version of American history.
Yeah, what's funny, and I know Josh has a question. Like, I have some of these things. I don't know why I have them so close to my desk. And for those that are listening, I'm showing them some learning history books that I bought.
Nice. Hey, we had the guy that did the Tuttle twins. Did they ever get the Tuttle twins in there?
I know. So
we had him on the show.
The Kid's Guide to Presidential Elections. This one's Kid's Guide to the Free Market, which my kids could not care less about the free market. And then the Kid's Guide to President Trump. Obviously, some of these aren't even open, so they may be collectors. But like when we're talking
Keep
about
them for the future, dude.
I know the materials that PragerU is providing. Like, do you get the sense that any of the materials was specially curated just for the Oklahoma, school district, given that they have an entire state now that they can market to?
So what you'll see if you go through the catalog of PragerU, there's nothing that specifically says, like, we created this for Oklahoma. But what you'll see is that the states that they have presence in will have some state-specific, some state-level history information, and some like get to know Oklahoma or get to know the history of Oklahoma. So you do see that kind of content for Oklahoma and for Florida, which also makes use of PragerU, or at least promotes it. Yeah, I mean, you'll see like all the standard kind of important moments in American history told through the lens of PragerU, and then also state-specific content.
That's interesting. I've been thinking as you're talking. Sorry about that weird transition there. I was in the middle of a thought, and then you stopped talking, and then I was like, I'm live, and I have to hit the unmute button. And my wife always goes, "Are you even listening?" And I'm like, "Yes, I'm listening. I have ADHD. Give me a break, dude. I'm trying to." Anyway, so
that sounds like an
of
excuse.
Course. Yeah, it kind of is. No, I am listening. And here's the thing that keeps coming up. So again, like one thing that I do is that I try to represent who I was. Number one, I have shifted in some of my views. I'm much more pluralistic than I was, not theologically, but certainly civically than I was. And that, if that doesn't make sense, I'm happy to go into more of what that means. But one thing though is like, it keeps coming back to me, this issue that education, right, is so important. That's why everyone wants a piece of it. They want it. They want to have their, whatever it is. You can call it an agenda. You could call it their values. You could call it whatever it might be, right? We want our kids to be educated in a certain way. People want that. Parents want that. And then, of course, the conglomeration and a state is very interested in how its young children are taught, educated, and then brought out into the workforce and potentially military force, right? When you're thinking about it on a large scale. And I guess like a lot of people, I'm assuming some of my MAGA friends will hear this and they'll think, I mean, are you serious? The left has had its ideology in the school system for decades. This is just a correction. This is not, this is just a pushback against the wave of Marxist ideology, the wave of communist ideology that's in left ideology, leftist. Again, I'm taking on the MAGA hat right now. The leftist ideology that's basically infiltrated our school systems for years. Or even think about something like the progressive liberal maybe agenda on something like California school systems, the Illinois school systems, Massachusetts school systems, and I'm sure that you can add more, right, to the conservative school systems, Texas, Louisiana, right? It goes back. So it's like, what is the core issue? And I think you're alluding to it in the sense that this choosing one particular thing, but don't we always come down to choose one particular way at the end? I mean, I guess I'm trying to get more clarity on thinking like, so it's like when you tell me the whole thing, I'm like, oh, I can see, I'm uncomfortable. I'm like, I don't really want, like you said, I don't want people, like some teacher I don't know teaching my kids the Bible and then having to do it, and they might not even care about it. Like, I would not be in support of that in Virginia school systems. And yet, I also there are things that I've seen over the last several years that I definitely was not in support of that were implementations within the school systems. Things like, kind of critical race theory. And I've done a lot of thinking into that. And I'm not trying to caricature critical race theory as one thing, but I understand why people could be uncomfortable with aspects of it being in and taught, if indeed they are. So I guess the question is, how do we respond to that kind of pushback? Again, what I want to do is help people come to the place where, hey, we're actually on the same page. We just are looking at it differently. But here's why our common shared good is that we don't want this kind of thing. Does that make sense? Okay. I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I think to your point, there would be discomfort with the idea of indoctrination, right? On either side, when we're talking about, political ideas or values. I think that I will say this, I think there's a disconnect between the rhetoric about what schools are, what they're teaching, what that woke liberal indoctrination really looks like, that conservatives are describing when they talk about public schools. The disconnect between the speech about it and then what is actually being taught. You mentioned critical race theory. So this is a really good thing to look at in Oklahoma.
Yes.
Back in 2021, there was a bill passed by the legislature that was widely referred to as the anti-CRT bill. And the idea was legislators were uncomfortable with schools teaching critical race theory. And so they talked a lot about CRT. The problem is the bill itself never mentions critical race theory. And the reason is that schools were not teaching critical race theory, by and large. Not that it was never, ever, there were no elements being taught in schools, but there was just such a divide between the way that people were talking about what schools were delivering to students and what schools were actually delivering to students. So I think most of us would agree that we want a true and accurate version of history to be taught. Right?
Yes, I hope we would agree with that. Yes.
I mean, right, right. So, to your point, like nobody wants, I've never met a parent who says, I really hope that my school is indoctrinating my child
Yeah.
to believe one thing or another. And I've also never met a teacher who's like, hey, I'm out here indoctrinating children to believe one thing or another. So I just think like there needs to be some more truthiness to like what we accept as the schools are indoctrinating. Like I think people will need to be careful um, to kind of push beyond the rhetoric and say, okay, well, what does this lesson teach my kid, or what are they
Yes.
being taught about the Tulsa Race Massacre, or whatever that is,
Yes.
and not just take at face value this idea of woke liberal indoctrination, because that's really powerful language that
Yes, it is.
in particular in Oklahoma really has been effective in leading people to think that their public schools are delivering anti-God, anti-Christian values.
It sounds like the majority of the debate about the curriculum in Oklahoma with the sort of Christian nationalism overtones to it. The way I see it, it seems like a lot of it is political in nature. I could be wrong, and I'd love for you to kind of fill in the gaps. But is there any sort of quantifiable, you know, like evidence that we could point to that shows that this Christian curriculum was actually benefiting, like helping kids, do better in school? Like, how does Oklahoma rank, for public schools within the country? Like, is there any other sort of data that we can use to say, yeah, this actually was working? We just may not, like the Christian part of it.
I suspect that if there had been great success out of Oklahoma as the result of some of these policy changes, we would have all heard about it. The truth is that Oklahoma ranks very poorly when it comes to standardized testing. So when we look at tests that measure kids all across the country, Oklahoma ranks very near the bottom in reading and math. We know that Oklahoma is spending less money per pupil than almost every other state. I mean, we really have the insight that we have into Oklahoma is that educationally, students are really struggling.
Got it. So the you mentioned earlier, so Ryan Walters is no longer in his job. What do you know about like his departure, and then what do you know about his replacement?
Everything about Ryan Walters' superintendency was like so interesting and headline grabbing nationally. His departure was no less so. It was interesting and headline grabbing. There were, rumblings that he was going to announce that he was leaving, and people thought, oh gosh, he's going to go to Fox News, and made all these sort of predictions. But ultimately, he went on to Fox News and said, I'm resigning as the superintendent of Oklahoma. I am going to go to an organization called the Teacher Freedom Alliance that is specifically designed to be an alternative to teachers' unions and to try to tear down existing teachers' unions in this country. So it was sort of a spectacular exit. He left amid a bit of a cloud of controversy over a number of things in Oklahoma, both financial things and also, policy decisions that he'd made.
Well, and also, wasn't there an image on his computer that that had like an hour's worth in the news?
It had a fair amount in the news, yeah. I was actually watching. Okay, so what happened was, just for your listeners, this happened during a state board of education meeting, executive session. So the board members and Ryan Walters are in Ryan Walters' office, and what board members later said is that an image of that included nudity appeared on Ryan Walters' television, made everybody very uncomfortable. He ended up turning it off, and then there was this kerfuffle yeah, there was this kerfuffle that followed that was like, you know, who's telling the truth, and Ryan Walters accusing them of lying, and it just really got very bizarre, frankly, and um, it got very bizarre and like became this big news thing. It ended up, I believe, being like a Jackie Chan movie. I,
Blame it on
it
Jackie
was some
Chan.
sort of
Oh, of
um,
course.
I could be wrong about the Jackie Chan part, but in any case, it was a movie that was playing in that moment that it featured nudity. But that became like something that the state was actively investigating, and like
Oh
Ryan
my
Walters
word.
was very much like in the crosshairs, and it was a big deal. So by the time he resigned, like that was just barely in the rearview mirror, and that was just the latest in a string of really peculiar things that became news in Oklahoma and across the country.
And
Man.
his replacement, like what do you know about his replacement?
His replacement is a man named Lindell Fields, and he comes from a career in tech education background. He's not a politician. There's frankly not a ton known about him. He seems to be a pretty low key guy. As soon as he came in, he sort of took this level approach and said, we're going to be looking at the things that Ryan Walters instituted. We're going to see if they make sense. You know, we're going to really sort of like inspect everything. We're going to open up, you know, look under the hood and see what's been going on here at the Department of Education. And that's pretty much what he's done. He said, you know, give me 90 days. I'm going to get these things done. Give me another, you know, number of days. We're going to get these things done. And he's come in and actually already very quickly reversed some of the things that Ryan Walters had come out and said. Like, for example, the teaching, the mandate that Ryan Walters issued that every classroom had to have a Bible and had to teach the Bible. Lindell Fields came in and said, no, that I do not support that. I'm going to revoke that. Ryan Walters, I mentioned earlier, was on this mission to end standardized testing, statewide standardized testing that would have required federal approval to do something like that. And Lindell Fields came in and said, no, testing will happen, right? Testing will happen. And they're going to review the standards, which, you know, they are technically in place. They are, you know, officially the state's next standards. So we'll see what happens with that.
I would love to focus in a little bit on it's just so interesting to me the 2020 like election prompts that they were giving and kind of this part of the curriculum that they were giving to students. And I'd love you to go a little bit deeper into that because and here's why for me, like it's still something that's being talked about quite a bit. Trump still talks about it. Even though I think on two occasions at least, right, he admitted that he did lose in 2020, but you know, two out of how many other claims has he made that he won? So I don't know what percentage that is. And I guess what was the justification for this claim? Because again, I know people that say, well, yeah, we should at least look at this. Why not look at the sides? Why not see what's going on here? And I'm aware that there's now the scant evidence, at least in terms of court documents and stuff like that I've seen that, you know, I do not think it was stolen in any way personally. But there's a lot of people that do and still do. And they might be like, hey, this is a claim that's worth investigating, even if, and I guess to steelman that, to make it its best possible argument, hey, this is a real thing that happened in people's minds. So there's a giant perception in the American public. So at least we would look at the reasons for that perception. Is that what they're doing? Or is it like, what was this 2020? How was this part of the curriculum? And how were they asking like teachers to operationalize this and actually bring it into the classrooms? Like, what would that even look like? Did they do that? Do we have any examples?
We don't know if they actually did that. And again, these are new standards that would have, if they had not been paused by a court temporarily, would have been in place for this school year.
Gotcha.
They are
but they
currently,
never did go into, okay.
not yet. We don't know what will happen with them, right? They are kind of
So those
withstanding a court
2020 ones
challenge.
are still in that. They're still in the standards that.
They are still, so right now, Oklahoma schools are using the last standards that were adopted, which was in 2019. And that's per a very recent court order that
Gotcha.
kind of halts the implementation of these standards, these new standards that, as I mentioned, the group of, Kevin Roberts and Dennis Prager and helped Ryan Walters come up with. But when it comes to the 2020 election, it's in a standard that's meant for ninth graders. So what a high school freshman should understand. And it advances the idea that we should accept the false claims about the 2020 election. And specifically that the ninth graders should learn about, this is the actual quote from the standards, the sudden halting of ballot counting in select cities in key battleground states, the security risks of mail-in balloting, sudden batch dumps, an unforeseen record number of voters, right? Those are all very specific claims that in the standards are accepted as fact. Even though, as you pointed out, there have been at least 60 lawsuits related to the validity of election results in 2020. Nearly all have been dismissed as meritless or were decided against the president. So that skepticism, it's not just introduced in the standards as something that students should be aware of, that there are skeptics of the 2020 election. It advances this idea as an accepted one, that the 2020 election did have discrepancies and that there were sudden batch dumps that were problematic, right? So I think that's the distinction. It's not teaching about history. Some people disputed the election. There was an event on January 6th. It's the idea that the standards accept as truth those conservative talking points.
What does it say about January 6th? I somehow, obviously I know that's connected.
No, I'm bringing up January 6th. That's like, that is, I think we could all agree.
I'd be super interested. Like, what was it? A peaceful protest that they were called?
Yeah. I don't recall that the standards specifically mentioned January 6th, but I'm saying that I think that most history teachers would probably agree that is an event that happened.
Oh yeah.
That one could teach about in historical context.
Absolutely. I think we should teach about January 6th and all of that. And yet what you're saying is that they're actually presenting this as factual. That these things happened, these dumps or, these discrepancies. And so these are factual. So it's almost like, yeah, and though that's patently false, is what you're saying. Like they're actually teaching unfactual things about it, or is it the interpretation that they're bringing of it? Does that make sense? And maybe you don't know the answer to that question. It's fine. I'm just kind of like having, these questions are coming to my mind as we're talking.
Yeah. And perhaps I'm not sure that there's really a distinction if you're presenting these discrepancies to students, to ninth graders, to teenagers as accepted, when we know through the legal process that these things did not happen.
Yes.
They were not real.
That's problematic.
Right. It becomes a factual.
Yeah.
It becomes a factual issue. And so when I talk to superintendents about the standards, they really, in addition to the Christianity, the infusion of Christianity throughout the standards, they found discomfort in this too. And one superintendent told me, we are looking for standards that are rooted in fact. That's what we want to prevail. And, the standards of what we need to teach children in Oklahoma cannot be based in opinion. It can't be opinion. That's not what social studies is about.
Yeah. I I'm curious about school vouchers and like school choice. That those two concepts are big with Republicans. It's really big for groups like Moms for Liberty and others. And I'm curious on like how successful was Oklahoma in increasing those those elements like for the school district, or did they never get far enough to really kind of really be pushing the vouchers?
They did. Oklahoma did expand. A lot of states have like some version of a voucher program that may apply, just to particular groups of students, like students with disabilities who may be trying to access very specific services. Oklahoma was in a similar position where it had kind of a small version of a voucher program, and the state expanded it, and it became available to students all over the state. So a universal voucher program. That was a big expansion. So there are, I think, about 37,000 students in Oklahoma using a tax-funded, voucher. It's really a scholarship tax credit. Sorry, a tax credit to attend a private or religious school in the state right now.
And did any of those like vouchers impact folks who are living in like the rural districts, low income students, or or people with disabilities?
So we've learned a couple of things just through our reporting on this. One is that vouchers are mostly used by people in cities. That's true in Oklahoma, because that's where the private schools are. There are lots of places in Oklahoma that are extremely rural, even very remote, where the only school available in the community is the public school district. Right? I stopped at one that served 50 kids. Right? There are no charter schools. There are no private schools with which to use a voucher physically located, in these areas. So there are lots of places where that is true. So the voucher use that we've seen in Oklahoma has been concentrated in cities, and it's also been concentrated among people who were already attending a private school, which is kind of interesting, right? So it's people who already were choosing to go to a private, a private or religious school, who then can use tax funds to offset the cost of tuition. So we've seen those couple of things in Oklahoma, but the rural nature of the state is really, really important to understand sort of like who has access. If you wanted to use a voucher, who has access and who can actually make use of that tax money.
It's so weird when he talked about the private school stuff. We had one of your colleagues on talk about school choice vouchers up in Ohio, and his story talked about people are using this money to do horse trainings or something like that, and just using it for very elaborate purchases that you'd have to draw a pretty squiggly line to see how it's connected to education. So that's really interesting. And it's almost like the states that have implemented these types of programs, I don't know if there's like an educational department IG or something like that, but it seems like they really, really need to be looked at pretty severely, because the money is not going where it's supposed to. So,
hey, well, Gabby needs her horse lessons. Okay, stop trying to take that away from Gabby.
Who am I to take that away from Gabby?
I mean, one interesting thing to understand is that part of the sort of more conservative vision for what schools should look like, school just generally in America, actually supports the idea that you should be able to purchase things like horseback riding lessons, piano lessons. So, the author of the education section of Project 2025 is Lindsay Burke. She now holds a top level position at the U.S. Department of Education. She has very explicitly advocated for a universal voucher system that really would function like like every family gets a debit card, right? Or like an Amazon gift card where they could
Whoa.
they could build their own, what they want for their children, their own educational system. So that could include tutoring, that could include private school, that could include micro schools or a homeschooling curriculum. It could include piano lessons. So that literally is, that's not a bug of the voucher system. Like that's a feature to many of the people who are imagining what real parental control of students' learning should look like.
So when I hear that, like that sounds like to me personally, like, oh, dude, that'd be awesome to be able to have money that I didn't earn, right? That was given to me to pay for my child's education. I mean, again, I'm getting taxed for it. I get that. But that sounds awesome. And yet there seems like there's a hidden part of this that I think we've alluded to in terms of the budgetary restrictions, the kind of pressure that it puts on a budget, and the in people and out people. Because I also think, well, who could actually afford to even not just to pay for those things, but to be able to, have the time and everything to do that? It seems like it favors people that already have money. But I don't know if that's true or not. I could see how people would think that. Is that what's happening? Like, I would love for you to go into more detail on how this is affecting people, that like how these vouchers and this money is actually this ripple effect to other people that are getting, it's basically a continuance of Will's question, but asking even in more depth, are people getting left out because Gabby's getting piano lessons or whatever, like, and the government's paying for it? Or I guess that's not happened yet, or has it? This is like an area where I don't have a lot of understanding.
Yeah, I think that you've highlighted like a piece of what that might look like from Ohio. I think you're talking about Alec McGillis's reporting. I So we've seen bits and pieces of this play out in other states that have had voucher systems for a much longer time. Ohio is one of those states. I was actually a beat reporter in Ohio when the ed choice system came to be. So we've seen pieces of this play out. The vision that Lindsay Burke has espoused, like, have we seen that realized anywhere? Not yet. Not yet fully. So we haven't seen that play out. But the question about who is left behind and who is left out of systems like this is a really good one. People who study private school vouchers and scholarship and tax credits and the whole world of school choice will tell you that there really aren't ways to spend money to fully fund traditional public school districts and keep those robust and healthy and fund all of the horseback riding lessons and piano lessons that you envision, and private school tuition, right? There's a finite amount of money, and that money shifts between those systems. So when you're thinking about kind of who is left behind, it's often in high use private school voucher and charter school areas. It's often the public school district. They end up having to run the same operation, right? Just because you lose a couple students, that doesn't mean you can lay off a teacher. So they still have to operate their buildings and buy books and pay for teachers, but often with less money, because as the students leave and choose other options, the per pupil funding that's coming from the state and local governments follows the students. That's true in most states. It's not always true, but so who's left out are people who are either choosing their local public school district that is then less resourced, or can't access, for whatever reason, a private school voucher. So kids in the most rural parts of the state that really don't have all those options, like they need their local public schools.
This is my last question, and it's kind of related to Oklahoma, but thinking about education as a whole, so as a person that's really been studying this space for a long time, there's a lot of talk up in Washington right now about abolishing the Department of Education. Regardless of the mechanics and process that will entail. But can you help us better understand, like, if the education department no longer existed next week, whenever that day comes, like what effect would that really have? Because I think, and I'm included in this, like, I don't think a lot of people really understand, like, why that's such a big deal. Because we just don't really understand maybe how the money flows, or, how curriculum gets developed and all that other kind of stuff. So, like, can you help us just better understand, like, what would happen if we didn't have an education department next week?
Right. So what we're hearing from the education department is a lot of discussion about returning things to the states. It's important to understand that the education department, one thing it doesn't do is establish curriculum. Doesn't do that. That is a state and local decision. What the department does do is act as a conduit for getting federal money for schools to states and school districts. So that's one huge function. Federal money for students who come from low-income families, federal money for students with disabilities. That flows from the federal government to states to school districts. That's one big function. The second big function is to act as an investigator and enforcer of civil rights in schools. The U.S. Department of Education has operated one of the country's largest enforcers of civil rights. Huge team of lawyers in 12 offices across the country, whose sole purpose was to make sure that students were not experiencing discrimination in their schools. That division has been effectively wiped out. So when it comes to, like, what are schools going to feel? There's already a lot of evidence that schools are going to feel financial strain. The Trump administration has scaled back a number of funding streams, and it has signaled through budget requests for the next fiscal year that they intend to spend less money on schools. So that's one thing that's going to be super consequential. Two is more of a question, it's more of an impact on parents and students. You are going to be in a situation for the first time in decades where there is going to be no public free way to try to hold your school district accountable for discrimination, whether that's racial discrimination, gender discrimination, sexual harassment, whether there are students who have disabilities, who are unable to access the education that they need or services they need. There's no federal free recourse for that now. And that is going to be really consequential to parents and students who are experiencing something in their school districts, because there are fewer places to turn to if you can't afford a private attorney.
Wow. Well, on that happy note, thank you so much, Jennifer, for stopping by. This was a very sobering conversation. I don't know if I should say I'm happy that Oklahoma got a new superintendent. I know a lot of people that are happy, but it's very unfortunate that we're kind of in this point, where an entire country actually knows the name of the superintendent from one state. That just seems weird, right?
It seems weird because it is weird. It is really unusual. And yeah, this is an issue that's really worth paying attention to.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Jennifer, where are your travels and your work taking you to next? Well, what's the next story you're focusing on?
There's probably more to be written in Oklahoma. It's such an interesting state. ProPublica's all over the country, so we're reporting all over the country. I think that the next stories and the thread that I've been following all year has been related to civil rights enforcement. It feels super consequential to students' experience at schools. So probably civil rights stories that are about students' experience at school.
That's awesome. Well, everybody, this is Jennifer Smith Richard. She's reporter for ProPublica, and we will make sure that we put links to her story in the show notes. Make sure you check that out, and make sure you like and subscribe, do all that stuff that helps us out. And yeah, thanks for stopping by. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, folks.